All right, so as people continue to file into our Zoom webinar, we'll go ahead and start. Welcome everyone, I'm Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with Julia Gillard, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and Ben Rhodes discussing women and leadership, real lives, real lessons. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Before we get started, we really want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Julia Gillard was the 27th Prime Minister of Australia, serving from 2010 to 2013. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was Nigeria's Minister of Finance from 2003 to 2006 and from 2011 to 2015, and Foreign Minister in 2006. She was Managing Director of the World Bank from 2007 to 2011, overseeing South Asia, Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. She is the author of Reforming the Unreformable: Lessons from Nigeria. Ben Rhodes is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The World as It Is, co-host of Pod Save the World, a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, the co-chair of National Security Action, and an advisor to former President Barack Obama. Co-authored by Julia Gillard and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Women is a Power to Action. Women make fewer than 1% of national leaders worldwide. This eye-opening statistic lies a pattern of unequal access to power. Some of the world's most powerful and interesting women, including Jacinda Ardern, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Christine Lagarde, Michelle Bachelet, and Theresa May, Women in Leadership explores gender bias and asks why there aren't more women in leadership roles. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Julia Gillard, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and Ben Rhodes. Thank you all.
Great. Well, thanks, Julia, for that introduction. And I'm really, really excited to be here to talk about a great book. I mean, this is one of the most important issues in the world today. One of the most interesting trends in the world today, and promising trends in a world that sometimes doesn't provide promising trends, is that we are seeing more and more women ascend to leadership positions, and we've seen very much how you get better outcomes when women are in leadership positions. We can talk about that, but obviously we see this in Jacinda Ardern's leadership, for instance, of COVID versus some other countries, including our own. But I wanted to start, by just asking you guys, Julia. Julia Gillard and I had the opportunity to get to know each other when President Obama was in office. I don't think I'm betraying any confidence in saying that Prime Minister Gillard was really one of President Obama's absolute favorite foreign leaders and people that he met in government. And Ngozi's has a towering reputation as a groundbreaker in Nigeria, but also for women around the world. And Julia, I remember visiting Australia with President Obama and really being struck in seeing, a Black man and a woman meeting as the leaders of the United States and Australia, and getting a sense of you were both a bit ahead of your time. Both nations were not necessarily ready, unfortunately, for that. There were backlashes in some ways in both nations to that groundbreaking feat of yours and President Obama's. We'll put his aside for now. And I was just wondering, for question for both of you to start, is you obviously come from different continents, blazed different paths. In some ways, again, broke through those glass ceilings before the culture, the politics had fully prepared for that in a way. Just to start the conversation, what brought you two together to do this? I mean, what is the origin story for how this book came to be? In terms of you both deciding that not only was this something you wanted to do, but this is something that you could do together.
Thanks, Ben. And I might go first if I can, Ngozi, and then go over to you. Thank you for reflecting back to the time we were doing some things together with President Obama. I've joked in the past that the problem with shattering a glass ceiling is that you end up surrounded by jagged shards of glass, and unfortunately they're pretty easy to cut yourself on. So yes, in my nation there was a cycle of backlash to a woman finally coming to the position as Prime Minister. And in many ways, it was living through that experience that is the origin story for this book for me. I left office with these questions circling in my head. You know, how much of my experience was about the times in which I governed? How much of it was about judgment calls I'd made, good ones and bad ones? And how much of it was simply because I was a woman? And I tried to unpack some of that when I wrote my biography, but I wasn't satisfied. I thought there's more here to understand. And at that stage, Ngozi and I were regularly coming into contact with each other because I chair and continue to chair the Global Partnership for Education. And she at that stage was chairing the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. So we'd end up at all of these global meetings talking about development policies. And increasingly we were drawn to each other and drawn to a conversation about what is going on with women in leadership. And I think both of us too felt that we wanted to do more than simply mentoring women. You know, we both try and do that, but there's a physical limit to how much any one individual can be a mentor to individual women. So what could we do which would be at a bigger scale? At that stage, I'd already created with King's College London the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So that was making a research contribution. But I wanted to do something that would be more readily accessible, perhaps a how-to guide for women when it came to leadership. So out of those conversations, the idea and the energy for putting this book together was born.
Well, just to complement what Julia said, she had this experience as Prime Minister, first woman leader, and the backlash you talk about. I was in Nigeria, the first female finance minister, and the longest serving finance minister, by the way, in the country's history. So 2003 to 2006, and then 2011 to 2015. And both times it was not an easy job. And, you know, there are certainly scars. And I think when I left the job the second time around, it had been quite a tough time with coming out of the experience of fighting corruption, trying to block leakages in government revenues, having, you know, people, the people who were blocking from taking government resources, becoming very upset, kidnapping my mother. I had had a tough experience. And then sensing also that some people were not all that happy to see a woman in this situation. And I've written a book, Fighting Corruption is Dangerous, to capture that experience. And one of the chapters actually talks about how some people just didn't like me because I was a woman. And they felt that the finance minister's post was a powerful one. And why should it go to a woman? There are those who thought I came from the World Bank and, you know, this is a Western background, and they didn't like that. So I discussed that experience. So having come from that, the idea of capturing what you go through in leadership. So I was drawn to Julia when we met several times because she had gone through this kind of, you know, difficult time. In addition, it seemed to me at that time and to Julia that there were a lot of women leaders going through problems. We had seen what happened to Dilma Rousseff, Madam Park in South Korea, and so on, and even Hillary in her run. And we began to wonder, what is it? You know, what's happening to women leaders at this time? And we thought, well, we have our experiences, but the experiences of other leaders might also be able to tell us something. And so we decided to put this down on paper and use it to explore leadership in a broader context and to see how we could help women leaders up and coming, you know, be able to navigate all the issues.
And I'm curious how you kind of chose which women leaders around the world to draw from in terms of the lessons that you wanted to impart. I mean, it's you know, everybody from Hillary Clinton to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to Theresa May. There's ideological diversity, and there's also diversity in position. You have people in politics, and then people like Christine Lagarde, who, well, were in politics, but also from a different perspective in terms of finances. How did you guys determine which stories you wanted to share, which examples you wanted to draw from in communicating the lessons that you wanted to impart?
Julia, go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, the whole approach of this book is to look at the global research that there is into women and leadership, and fortunately there is ever more sophisticated research available. And out of that, we drilled 8 hypotheses. You know, the research tells us, for example, that when people look at a powerful woman, they assume that she is unlikable. So we drilled hypotheses, and then we thought we want to see if they come true in the lived experience of women leaders. And this who to select was actually very, very complicated, because we want the book, and we think it does, speak to women and leadership in all walks of life. And initially we thought maybe we should try and draw women from all walks of life. But ultimately, we sort of settled on drawing women predominantly from politics, not because this is a book solely about politics, but because we thought that the spotlight on women and leadership is at its hottest, brightest for women in politics. And so what we could learn from those experiences would hold true more broadly. And then we wanted the book to be a truly global book. I mean, the fact that Ngozi and I had come together to do it, Australia, Nigeria, we've obviously coming from different cultures and contexts. We wanted to capture that in the selection of women leaders. And so that led us around the world, you know, to Norway in the north, to, you know, New Zealand in the south, to South America, to Africa, to Europe. We want to America itself, we wanted to put together women who would come from a diversity of perspectives, political parties, upbringings, to see what they had in common and what would be very different. And I think for both Ngozi and I, when we started out on this, we thought that culture and context would matter so much. So we were asking ourselves the question, you know, how much can Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman to lead Liberia, really have with Theresa May, the second woman to lead the United Kingdom? And yet when we got into it, we found that whilst of course many things were different, in the experience of being a woman leader, there was a surprising amount that was the same right around the world.
Let me add to that, you know, there were a couple of women, you know, who were on the list that we also added, but somehow in the busy schedules, we could never quite connect with respect to, you know, having the interviews that were needed in order to finish the book. And at the end, we decided, well, we'll go with the 8 we've done. So there was a slightly larger universe, but we had to drop a couple in that.
And Ngozi, when to Julia's point about you know, and I was struck. I mean, I was struck by the kind of some of the commonality of experience. But I'm wondering how you reflected on, you know, what seemed to be the most prominent common experiences that span geography, and whether there were differences based on the culture or politics of a particular country. Like how much did you come away from this feeling like, boy, these are very uniform or common experiences that women face in pursuing positions of leadership in different fields, obviously, you know, particularly politics, but others, as you say, versus how much do you think that there's a variance depending on where people are?
Well, you know, that's the interesting thing. As we put this book together and went through the stories of the women, and we went through the literature as well, as Julia said, we found so much more commonality than differences. That was the amazing, right from the experiences some of these women had as children, growing up, down to the experience as adults. Let me just take one, you know, as children. One of our first chapters or hypothesis is "You Go Girl." And in this, you know, we try to look at what was the beginning. How were the women raised? You know, were they raised as leaders? Did they feel any barriers in their way what was their childhood experience that might inform how they entered leadership later. And we found that one thing common to all of the women is that nobody told them that there were things they could not do in life. They all grew up feeling that, look, they could do anything, they could be anything. Their families did not hold them back. And I think this is, an experience we think is very important. If you come from an environment that is nurturing, expects you to go out and do things, including leadership things, you will grow up like that. And that was virtually a common theme across all the women. So that was interesting and surprising to me. And I think for Julia and myself, we also had the same experience, coming from backgrounds where we were not held back. We were not told we could do things that we couldn't do, things boys could do. That didn't arise. So that's one. Another one we found very common is that these women leaders don't know it all. They are still struggling. They don't have all the answers. They still have questions. They still have some self-doubt. And we really wanted to share that with others, that even when you get to that top position, you don't have all the answers. You still have to struggle. You struggle from day to day. So just a couple of the areas where we found a lot of commonality.
Yeah, I'd add to that. And,
go ahead, Julia. Go ahead.
Sorry, Ben. I'd add to that and just say the women leaders also had commonality on having to think about appearance questions. They didn't all answer them the same way, but each woman leader had to think about what she dressed in. Each of them had experienced more interest in their family structures, whether they had children, who was looking after their children. If they didn't have children, why didn't they have children, than men would have. There was some variation, and I think this is a bit correlated with the level of partisanship in politics. So no surprise that Hillary found this more intensely than some of the other women. The research does show us, as I said before, that people think women leaders aren't likeable, and it even goes so far, and we entitled one of our hypotheses, "She's a bit of a bitch." The research shows that people can have very adverse, visceral reactions to women who appear to them to be offending against gender stereotypes by being leading and commanding. Now, in some political environments, women didn't feel that. You know, the more benign environment, for example, of New Zealand, where Jacinda Ardern is the third woman to lead the nation, that wasn't a feature for her. But of course, it was a big feature of Hillary Clinton's campaign in the US. So some differences, some commonalities.
There's an interesting thing, Ben, take off on what Julia just said, if you don't mind. Sure. And that is how the women dealt with their appearance. And some of them said they just developed a look, which you could almost term as a uniform. Men come in their suits and nobody asks questions, except once when President Obama wore the brown suit and a lot of commentary. But usually men come, their suits and ties is like an everyday uniform. Women have to struggle about what they wear because people look at them and criticize them so much more. So these women, some of them developed a kind of uniform or appearance, so that they appeared in it every day, be it the pantsuits that Hillary wore, the African outfits that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf would wear and I wear. I also share that. For that reason, I love my African clothes. I'm African, but I developed a look. So people don't start to think about my appearance, but focus on what I say, because I appear in this look every time. And that was a kind of approach and answer by these women. So that was very, very interesting to find every woman was going through that.
Yeah, I know, it's fascinating, and everybody should really pick up the book, because one of the things I noticed here that's so, remarkable is you get, that kind of basic, totally accessible set of insights, in addition to kind of, my wife worked in the Global Women's Issue office at the State Department, as well as kind of real research and background on the kind of the qualitative and quantitative aspects of the barriers women face. I did want to also add to folks, If you have questions, you can put them. There's a Q&A function. There's a chat and Q&A function, but if you can put your questions in the Q&A, we'll shift out audience questions in a bit here. I'll try to look at both the chat and the Q&A, but I just draw people's attention to the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom. Julia, I wanted to ask you that, you obviously, first person to occupy the office of Prime Minister as a woman. How much do you think the experience of having someone like you break a barrier, how much are you finding that it makes it easier? And obviously there hasn't been another woman Prime Minister yet, unfortunately, in Australia, but how much does that mean that there's less jagged glass around the people coming after? How much does, both in terms of the role model impact, but also just in terms of the societal acclamation to women leaders? How important are the, because I think everybody that you lift up here is largely seen as a real path breaker, as a real trailblazer in their field, in their country. But what is that impact? And how did you think about that when you were Prime Minister? Did you have to do the job? And I remember, again, dealing with this with President Obama in terms of being the first Black president. He's like, well, what I have to do is I have to do the job. But obviously there's an implicit, you have to be thinking too that how are boys and girls in Australia looking at me? So I was wondering just how you balanced you yourself, and then in terms of the other women you look at in the book, this question between, it's all about doing the job versus being kind of aware that everything you're doing is the first time that you've done it. And some people are very inspired to see you in that role. Some people are very uncomfortable to see you in that role. Like, how did you balance those potentially competing impulses?
That's a great question. And ultimately, the conclusions of the book are optimistic in the sense that having women do the job does make more space for more women. I'm absolutely convinced of that in Australia, but I'm reinforced in that by the discussions we had with the 8 women leaders in the book. Jacinda Ardern, Theresa May, Erna Solberg, who are not the first women to lead their nation, were absolutely clear that the fact that there had been women who had led before had meant that there was more space for them. People were less likely to ask the question in their heads, can a woman do this? Because the more time they see a woman do it, that question falls away, and then they're just judging that woman on the basis of, is she doing it well or is she doing it badly, which are the kind of assessments we make of political leaders irrespective of gender. So I do think that there's a really optimistic conclusion in that the more we crack through and get women to the top, the easier it will become for the next woman and the next woman. And I think there's a second thing that goes along with that, which is having women at the top or even aspiring for the top promotes the right conversation. So one of the things I've really seen here in Australia is when I was Prime Minister, the sort of fashionable political analysis from the press gallery in our national capital, Canberra, and others was gender was playing no role in how my leadership was being perceived. Kind of crazy when you look back on it, but that was the fashionable analysis. Now here in Australia, we're having a very lively debate about women in politics, and much of that is drawing on my experiences. And it might sound like a really humble thing to say, we're having the right conversation, but ultimately things don't get fixed unless people talk about them, and we're talking about the right issues now. In terms of, doing the job or saying, look, I'm the first woman to do it, or President Obama's case, the first African American. I think for the person in the moment, and I certainly found this, my predisposition was to allow doing the job to speak for itself. And when I look back on my time in office, I also thought that the most gendered critiques of me as Prime Minister would all happen in the early period of my Prime Ministership. And then the interest in that, me being the first woman, would fall away over time, and it would be more like business as usual, though that's pretty rough and tumble in Australia. What I actually found was, if anything, gendered critiques and gendered criticism grew over time as the government got into choppier political waters. The gendered insult, for example, became the go-to weapon. So that has reinforced in me that it is always the right time for women leaders and the rest of us to be talking about women and leadership. And we've got to recognise that for the woman in the moment, she's got to be doing the job. So actually, the people who need to sustain that conversation, we shouldn't just be looking to her. We should be making sure that we're all having that conversation. And one thing I was delighted to see in the, apart from the result, in the recent US election, was that when gendered moments came for Vice President Harris, the burden wasn't on her shoulders to call them out. People were instantly in the public square using, you know, the hashtag "we've got her back" and things like that to say, look, this is gendered, it's the only reason it's being said, or it's racist, it's the only reason it's being said, and in real time, sort of forcing the conversation that we need to have. And I think that's quite different from what surrounded Hillary in the 2016 campaign, where so much of the critique of her was gendered, but it wasn't called out as promptly and as clearly in real time. So that's a very good trend.
Just
go ahead, Ngozi, sorry.
Yeah, just very quickly, since Julia has really eloquently captured it, I just wanted to add that there was the issue of results. How did you focus on the job? I think you'll find that the women were very conscious about focusing on the job and producing results, particularly if they were the first. But I'd say across the board, I remember Christine Lagarde talking about getting to the IMF and working hard all through, reading the briefing books, putting in so much. She put in so much more. And all of them saying women have to put in so much more than men in the same position. That was a refrain. So that focus on the job and getting results, I think, is very important. And I certainly felt that in my case as finance minister, I focused a lot on the job and having good results. And I thought that if I did that, then the way would open for other women. Since President Obasanjo had been brave enough to name me as a woman in the first place. And what happened? That it worked. After me came, you know, not just one woman finance minister, but three. So to me, it worked. If you get results, people then forget. They just focus on the job and not on whether you're a woman or not.
Yeah, well, and that leads to a question I was going to ask you, Ngozi, which is that, you know, you spent most of your career, you know, in World Bank, finance, in this field, right, that is sometimes been gendered. We just got our first woman Treasury Secretary in the United States with Janet Yellen. And
Yay,
you know,
we beat you to it.
you did. You blazed that trail, right? And there are these areas where, you know, you just get a set, you know, defense. We've never had a woman Secretary of Defense in the United States. We did just get our first director of our intelligence community, but finance and the military, and it's telling that there are these areas of kind of government or private sector that feel more gendered than others. And I'm just curious about your personal experience, you know, being in one of those areas, finance, as you say, where it took someone, you know, to obviously help you break that barrier. Whether you've, and then in the book itself, whether you found that there are different areas of public life and public service where it's harder for women than others because there may be more gender stereotypes that come into it, or more of a sense that, you know, men do this. I mean, obviously wrongly, but do you find a variance in terms of why it is that some areas like finance and defense and others seem to lag behind others in terms of women rising to not only rising but breaking that glass ceiling to reach the top?
Well, if you look at, certainly, Ben, if you look at the research too, I think there are certain jobs that people have biases about that are more seen as male, quote unquote, male jobs, you know, across the board. I really sense that. And if you look at the research we did in so many fields, You find, well, leadership itself, out of the 193 countries in the members of the United Nations, only 57 have had a woman leader. And at any one time, in fact, in 2000, there were only 4 women leaders. I think right now in 2020, there might be about 13 or 14. So you could say there's been progress, but just look at it out of the universe. So people see that leadership at the top as a male job. So it's so much harder to break into. And I think the same thing happens like engineering. I think only 15% of engineering jobs have women in them. There are some fields like that. Okay, so you go to finance and defense, and I find that in the minds of people, those are really jobs that, quote unquote, men should be doing. So if you look across the world, you find, when I was finance minister, I can't remember the numbers now, but there were very few women in finance ministry positions, whether it was in developed countries, rich countries, or poor countries. It was mostly men. And the same you'll find in defense. But I'm very proud, actually, that in my country, we had a female finance minister, and the second time I was in office, we also had a female defense minister. So trying to find the president or the leader or those ready to break these barriers in politics is very helpful, because there's that stereotype of certain positions as male. And then when you break through and you're able to deliver on results, it shows clearly that there's nothing male about this. As Julia is fond of saying, we said in the book, the brains of men and women are not configured differently. So there's no reason why some area of leadership should belong to men and then some to women.
Mm-hmm. And Julia, as you became prime minister, what did you have a sense that there were certain kind of aspects of the job that people were more comfortable seeing you doing than others? How was your kind of lived experience of that, and how did you, in your own way, work through that, fight through that, push back against resistance, given the kind of multitude of responsibilities a prime minister has?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Ngozi just said, and your thesis here, Ben, which is, mostly if you ask people around the world to close their eyes and imagine, not the current leader of their country, but just, close your eyes and imagine a president, imagine a prime minister, imagine a CEO of a global business, imagine a military leader. I think in order, people would imagine, men in suits for the president, prime minister, and the CEO of the business, white men in suits. And then for the military leader, they'd imagine a man in a braided uniform, one of those dress uniforms. So in the whole area of leadership, we're pushing against the stereotypes. We actually explore this in the book. We explore research that is Think Manager, Think Male, which has done a long track of views that people hold about leadership characteristics and male characteristics, and the coincidence between the two of them, whereas they think women are more nurturing, more empathetic, and therefore less likely to be the one in charge. But I do think, that is still with us, but there is this nuance to it. And when I was prime minister, if I was in a school talking to school kids, I think people would have thought there's still something a little bit odd about this context, because normally a man is prime minister, but that would have struck them as more in keeping with what they think of women than when I was overseas and was being greeted by a military guard. And you do that inspecting of the guard, where as a woman, you're walking past rows and rows of troops standing to attention. And in many countries in the world, all of those troops standing there are men. So I do think that there's still some areas where people are much more likely to cling to this, think manager, think leader, think male. I did, on this area of defence, just wanted to point to one, I think, beautiful story in the book. We spoke to Michelle Bachelet, who was the first woman to lead Chile, the only woman to date to lead that nation. and her father had been a general. And when the Pinochet regime came to power, he was taken and he was tortured until his heart gave out and he died in imprisonment. And that started for her a life where she too was imprisoned for a period and tortured. And then she was on the run. She lived in exile, including for a part of that time in Australia, and then came back to her nation. And she became Minister for Defence. And so people have always asked her, you know, when you took that position on, what must have been in your mind was how life had come full circle. Your father, a general, his life destroyed, and his daughter becomes Minister for Defence in a democratic regime. And she said, no, what was on her mind at that moment was that she couldn't speak in too soft a voice, that if she used a soft voice, she wouldn't be taken seriously, that she really had to project her voice in a way that isn't necessarily natural to her. And it says something very human and very understandable, but also very sharp about how these gendered stereotypes still play into women's experiences, women's conduct, and women's memories.
I mean, Ben, isn't it amazing that today only 6.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women, and only 6% of FTSE 100 CEOs are women? I mean, you know, to strengthen what we're saying about this kind of male who should be in a job, we're still here. We're celebrating some success that we've moved in leadership. But when you look at the numbers, it will take us, I don't know how many years to really get to 93, 100 years, if we keep going at this pace, to get to equality. And it's not a trivial matter, because, you know, it costs the global economy something. You know, McKinsey has done this study showing that if there's gender equality for men and women, you know, the globe would add another $28 trillion of GDP. You know, so it's not as if inequality is costless. It's quite costly. And we really need to reflect on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great, you know, and frankly, you know, the political outcomes, as I said, have been better with women in positions of leadership, but also, you're right, the overall output, productivity, and potential of societies is obviously being held back. I wanted to ask one more question, and there's some great questions in the chat that I'll move to, which is, you know, obviously this is a Washington-based event, even though we're, you know, scattered around the world here. And Kamala Harris, Julia, you mentioned, you know, recently broke a ceiling here in becoming vice president. And you know, on the one hand, obviously that, you know, that example is important. On the other hand, I noticed, you know, you mentioned pushing back against kind of stereotypes, but one of them is simply this idea that, you know, she's really ambitious, you know, like she's, you know, I remember the chatter when she was picked to be vice president. Well, she shouldn't be vice president because she may want to be president, and that's what you'll think about. Never mind that just about every politician I've ever met, like, has thought that they're is ambitious. Like, that's why they're politicians. Well, what about this kind of dynamic of you talked about the kind of, you know, cultural and personal alterations you have to make that men don't have to think about, whether their appearance or how they talk or how they walk in a room. But this question of ambition and versus, you know, the question between, you know, not wanting to appear too ambitious versus, you know, obviously you have to be ambitious and you have to want to be breaking down doors, you know, to make change. How, in looking at the specific example of Kamala Harris, but how important is what she's achieved, but also how have you reacted to this dynamic that we've seen applied to her, which is that, you know, it's somehow a liability that she's moved so fast because she might be overly ambitious in some way. And either one of you, you know, feel free to take that.
Well, I on this question of ambition, on this question of ambition, we cite some research in the book, which I think is incredibly powerful. It was a study done at Yale, and what they did is they got, you know, representative groups of voters, two groups, put them in two different lecture theatres, had a male candidate go and speak to one group, a female candidate go and speak to the other group, and they were pitching for their votes. Now, actually, they weren't political candidates. They were both, actors. But the important thing was that they'd been given exactly the same script to pitch for votes. And the script included lines like, I'm the kind of person who gets things done. I might have to stand on people's toes to deliver, but I always come through. And those very, ambitious, controlling, commanding lines from a man, fine. And when people were polled, do you want to vote for this man? People were fine with voting for him. Exactly the same words, when delivered by a woman, were seen to be offensive, and the number of people prepared to vote for her went sharply down compared with the man. So we don't like it. We're hardwired with these sexist stereotypes that still whisper in the back of all of our brains to think male, commanding, controlling, ambitious for self, that's fine. Women must be empathetic, nurturing, put the team first, look to the needs of others. And if a woman breaks any of those stereotypes, then we think, it offends against this whisper, this stereotype in the back of our brain. And we explored that with each of our women leaders. And they talked about, having to stay on this tightrope where they looked strong enough to lead, because if you look weak, people won't give you the job. But they still looked empathetic, because if you didn't look empathetic, people would think you were a bit of a bitch and they wouldn't want to vote for you. And Vice President Harris is on that tightrope now. And I'm sure she and her team, they're very sophisticated. They understand all of that. They'd be thinking about all of this. They would have thought about it in the campaign. But it's a lot to ask that someone for 4 years stays on that tightrope. And so all of us have to make more space so that it's, less of a tightrope and more of a broad road that women candidates can walk and women leaders can walk. And in US history, has it ever been a net disadvantage for a vice president? Obviously, they're there to support the president, so they've got to do that job. Yeah. But has it ever been a net disadvantage for the vice president in the back of their brain to be saying to themselves, I reckon I could be president one day? We don't mark men down for that. So why should we mark the first woman to be vice president down for that?
And Ben, I want to add to that if you think this tightrope is difficult for women to walk, it's even more difficult if you're a woman of color. Because in these leadership posts, we say in the book, there's kind of a pecking order that goes in the way people view leaders. It's white males, then black males, then white females, then black females. So if you're a woman of color, you're even more seen as being ambitious if you step off that tightrope. So I'm just saying we don't go too much. We have not explored too much about the issue of being a woman and being a woman of color, but we do talk about it in several instances in the book because it's so much more difficult. There's so fewer women of color in these kinds of positions. So you can imagine what Vice President Kamala Harris is dealing with and has to deal with in future. She was labeled as unlikable, horrible, not fit to be president.
It's a very good warning. Well, I want to pivot to some of these questions, and people can vote on the questions that are also there. But I'll kind of skip around. There's one that there's a term actually I haven't really heard before, which is one question says there's recently been discussion of a quote glass cliff, meaning that women are often put into leadership positions when an organization is flailing, which can set them up for failure as much as success. Did you find this in your research? And actually, Theresa May cries out to me as someone who was handed, literally, a fail. There's no way she could have succeeded. It was, like this incredibly polarizing vote happens. David Cameron steps down. It's going to be impossible to reconcile the promises of Brexit with the reality. So I took it to Theresa May, but you don't have to take it there either. Just this question of a glass cliff and whether you found that in your research.
Yeah, I would say so, Ben. I'll just say a little and then, hand it back to Julia. that this glass cliff phenomenon, we did find it in our research and found it in the experience that some of the women had. I think Christine again comes to mind when she she was asked to take over running the whole of Baker McKenzie, the law firm that she was a partner in, at a time when the firm was going into serious difficulty, and none of the other male members wanted to run it. She was approached, and as we say, foolishly, she took it and she ran it and brought it all back, resuscitated it and put it back on a good footing. That's just one example. I mean, both of us also, we've lived our own glass cliff moments, and I may yet live another one if everything works out all right. So it makes you wonder. People are ready to bring women in when an organization is experiencing serious trouble. We've got one waiting, and that's the WTO.
Yeah, that's for sure.
This terminology, the glass cliff, comes out of research that was done when the Times newspaper, this is going back a few years, the Times of London, published a piece saying women CEOs drive down share prices. And they'd done a very, what researchers shouldn't do, they'd just done a correlation, not a causation, gone women CEOs lower share prices. And researchers in the UK unpacked all of that. And what they actually found was that the lower share prices were a predictor of getting a female CEO. So basically a business that was going well, it's time for the CEO to change. They think everything's going well. We basically want a CEO who's a lot like the current CEO. The current CEO's a man in a suit. We'll get another man in a suit, job done. It's when the business had got into trouble, share price down, problems everywhere. People said to themselves, you know what, we need to change something up here. We need something different. We're in trouble. Oh, I know, let's get a woman CEO. And it might also be who puts themselves forward, that, men who are, going to stand out as likely to be appointed as CEOs might be able to pick and choose opportunities more, whereas women who find it hard to crack into that rank of CEO might be more prepared to put themselves forward, even though there's plenty of warning signs about how difficult it's going to be. And Ngozi is right. I mean, Christine Lagarde lived through that glass cliff experience, Baker McKenzie. She certainly lived through one too with the International Monetary Fund when she took over after the former head had to resign, having been charged with a sexual offence. Jacinda Ardern, now celebrated around the world as such a wonderful success story, but she took over leadership of her political party weeks before an election, just weeks before, because the leader who was in the job had got such bad polling figures that he resigned. Everybody knew he couldn't do it. And so they handed it to her, almost mission impossible. Can you lift our polling stocks from right down in the basement to winning in a matter of weeks? And, we haven't got any money as a political party and we don't know how we're going to finance the campaign. Can you deal with all of that? And of course, she did, and history was made. But so many glass cliff moments in the stories of our women leaders. And I think telling them is important for people to get that sense of context and how we judge women leaders, because otherwise I think it's easy to do the same sort of lazy judgment that the Times did, which is that women leaders and bad times are somehow associated with each other. So unless we go more deeply, then we don't understand that. And I think Theresa May is a fantastic example. I mean, people might have their criticisms of how she played out the cards she was dealt, taking over from David Cameron in a crisis moment. But let's be absolutely clear, she wasn't dealt a handful of aces. She had a pretty bad hand of cards, and she, played them out. And for people to look at that and say, oh, that's because she was a woman, it's completely ridiculous. It was because of the hand of cards she got dealt at that moment in British history.
Well, another question here that folks from Akshaya Shivkumar, which a number of you have lifted up here too, which is I think really relevant to probably what you're trying to do in the book, but what do you wish someone had advised you when you were starting out your career as young women leaders? You know, if you could go back and advise yourself, what would you say for either of you?
I think I would say that I wish I had been advised it would be it would be so much more difficult than I thought. You know, so I could have been prepared more. And I think that's one of the things that we thought would be good about this book. For women who would read it, you know, sometimes you can't change the circumstance, but at least you can be prepared for it. I mean, you might not be able to change this issue that we take up in She's a Bit of a Bitch, of being unlikable, being seen as some kind of a shrill leader, but you can work the circumstances if you know about it beforehand and manage it. So I wish I had known or been told that it would, there would be so many more obstacles. You know, my parents actually were wonderful. They assumed you could do any and everything. So it just seemed like a good progression, but you meet so many more obstacles along the way. And so for me, that is it. Another thing is, you know, just being yourself as a leader. You know, people have to learn that they don't need to change who they are. At the end of the day, as Jacinda Ardern said, we should all be able to be ourselves and be the kind of leaders that people will still respect. And for me as a person, I've really been that. I've been myself. I've not felt the need to be someone else, you know, behave like a man when I don't need to, or behave in a certain way. So I think those are some of the good lessons.
I agree with all of that. And I just really think the main message from us in some ways is be ready. You know, I'm of that generation here in Australia. I was in university in the early 1980s. In our political party, we fought for an affirmative action rule in the early 1990s. And I had this naive view that this, you know, issue of gender equality, gender and politics, it was changing really quickly. And so, you know, this wouldn't be a big feature of my career in politics because it was changing so incredibly quickly, only to find, of course, yes, it was a big feature of my career in politics. And so for women who are starting out, I'd say, you know, even if your moment of leadership is not going to come for 10, 20, 30 years, don't assume all of these issues will have gone to zero. Of course, we'll all be fighting for change, but there will still be some remnants of it around. And get ready. You know, I use the expression, you've now got the benefit of having seen this movie before. You can see what's happened to other women leaders, and that enables you to war game what you're going to do when the moment comes. And all of us are better when we're prepared. And the other message I'd want to get through to a younger version of myself is, yes, there will be these obstacles, but there will be incredible moments of joy in it. You know, don't be dissuaded, absolutely go for it, because the good bits certainly outweigh the bad bits. You know, in talking about gender equality, we're focusing on what still needs to change, but the joy that comes with being able to put your values into action as a leader, there's nothing like it. So please still go for it, still aim for it.
It's a great advice for life in general. One specific question, and Julia, this comes to you, but again, you know, feel free to both take it. But this Tara Cheston, Julia says, I appreciated Julia Gillard's leadership as Deputy Prime Minister of Education when I was studying at the University of Sydney. I would love to hear how she feels education institutions can ensure women and girls are able to achieve more equity. And I guess to just broaden that out, you know, some of what we've been talking about are kind of societal norms, political norms. What did you find in terms of the specific role of education and institutions of education in trying to bring about more equity in life for women?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. I think the starting stone for any discussion about education is You know, in the US, here in Australia, we happily live in societies where for a number of years now, women have outperformed men on educational attainment. And it can blind us to the fact that that is not true in so many parts of the world. So with my Global Partnership for Education hat on, I mean, we work in almost 70 countries around the world where, you know, the chance of a girl completing 12 years of education is still 1 in 10. Most girls will not go to secondary school. Many girls will not complete primary school. And the most marginalised children are the ones most likely to miss out. And the most marginalised child is very, very likely to be a girl. So, you know, this educational opportunity, we've got to make sure that it's true for women and girls everywhere. But even when the promise of educational opportunity comes true and more women are coming out of universities and other forms of training and education than men, we still have gendered bits. One, who studies which course, so things like engineering, as we've examined before, you know, the STEM subjects still tend to be disproportionately male. And the university institutions themselves, particularly at their upper ranks, still tend to be disproportionately male. So there's a journey of change that needs to happen in education institutions if they're going to be exemplars of gender equality, and doing the research, like the research we do at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, which can be taken up and used throughout society to bring change. So, you know, my message, I guess, is dig behind the raw numbers. People often cite these statistics about women in education to say, you know, if more women are coming out of university than men, everything's fixed. Whereas if we do the deeper dig, we know that's not true. Courses studied are gendered. Access to postgraduate degrees is still gendered. Access to academic pathways is still gendered, and we've got to break that down.
Let me just add, Ben, some concrete fact. There have been so many economic and econometric studies now that show that educating a woman or a girl not only improves the welfare of that the person being educated, but that of the household and then that of the nation. So there's a direct economic benefit. You know, when you take a woman or a girl from primary to secondary education, it has a direct bearing on how her children perform later on in life. It has a direct bearing on how many children she will have and how spaced they will be. So there are just so many linkages showing that there's a net economic benefit to society at all levels by educating girls and women. So it's not just a moral issue. It's an economic imperative if the world is to do better.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question because we're about at the hour. I feel like this could go for a much longer time. And there's a question here that says, when do you predict that politics will become more inclusive toward women, which is obviously a very broad question. I guess I'll just, you know, to put a fine point on that, you know, on the one end, you could look at, you know, the picture around the world and feel like, you know, we're maybe at some tipping point, right? Like you see more and more women rising to positions, certainly of political leadership, and to some extent corporate leadership. At the same time, and I've noticed particularly, you know, younger women too, like a very young generation of prime ministers, you know, we see taking office. I have a friend who's 43 who just became the prime minister of Estonia a couple of days ago. At the same time, as you point out, and then Ngozi, you cited some of the data before, and it's in the book, you know, we have a long way to go in terms of equity in the leadership, not just of governments, but of government agencies, of international institutions, of corporations. So in your view, where are we? And are we potentially reaching a point where this is all going to accelerate exponentially? And or I mean, as two women leaders yourselves, but also as people who've dug into the data, you know, how should we think about the progress we've made, and how close are we to really seeing that kind of take off in a way, or is this a much longer haul?
For me, I would say that it's a much longer haul. You heard Julia say that when she became prime minister, she thought, that issues of gender would no longer be front and center. It would all be, things were changing so fast, to pick her words. And that's what you think, because the fact that there were 4 female leaders in the year 2000, and today there are 13 or 14 makes you think, wow, Yeah. I just saw a video go out yesterday or today showing all the women leaders. So you kind of feel, wow, we're making a difference. But then you always have to put it back in the broader context. And when you see just how many nations there are where there are women leaders, then it seems so few. And the rate of change is so small. So I'm not sanguine. There's still, in my mind, too many positions in this world where glass ceilings are being broken, where women have never had a chance, be it globally or within countries. So I really think we are not yet at that tipping point. I'm hoping that we'll get there because we have a young generation of women coming up, who won't stand for many of these things anymore, who will find their ways to break through. But if you ask me, are we at a tipping point now? I would say no. We still have some ways to go. It's a long haul story, but we have to keep at it.
I agree with Ngozi. The World Economic Forum puts out statistics every year and that tell us country by country the size of gender gaps, and tell us globally how long it's going to take to close gender gaps. And in political leadership, political representation, their estimate is almost 100 years. And in economic equality, their estimate is more like 200 years. And I think sometimes when we think about trends here, we make that error between sort of stock and flow. So we look at the number of women leaders now and look at all their faces and we say, that's good. But to get to genuine equality, I mean, Ben, you'd have to live in an America where every, second president on average was a woman.
Yeah.
So, most presidents get 8 years. So it would be, very routine for a woman to be there for 8 years. And then maybe the next president would be a man, or a woman would be there for 8 years and be replaced by a woman. There would be 16 years of a woman being president. Maybe the next one along's a man and the next one along's a man. And then you go back to it being a woman. Like, that's a long way from the USA that we know today. And I'm not just, highlighting the USA. That's a long way from almost everywhere in the world today. It is only New Zealand and Iceland that have had 3 women leaders that are on their 3rd woman leader. So we need it to be routine for countries around the world, for business corporations, for militaries, for civil society organisations and the like, to have had so many women leaders that they basically don't keep count anymore. When we get to that stage, then we'll be talking about gender equality. Now, what can we do? Because we don't want to depress people about any of that. Human problems get solved by human beings being determined that they're going to change it. And we hope that our book is part of that process of change by putting a spotlight on these issues and hopefully energising people and giving them some strategies, whether it's in their workplace, in a community group, if they're involved in politics, practical strategies to use for both women and men to bring that change about.
We usually say, you go for it, go girl.
we do.
Well, look, I really appreciate that. And first of all, I apologize if the 2 young women leaders in my house have been making noise behind me. I can hear them. I don't know if you could, my 4- and 6-year-old daughters. But I want to thank, this was an extraordinary discussion. And the book is really phenomenal, Women in Leadership. And I want to just make a point that I hope men read this and digest it. That may be the most important audience in a way, because oftentimes, these discussions get segmented as gender discussions, and men, I myself have, said the platitudes, but haven't done enough to dig in. And so I really hope that, I hope this reaches as broad as possible an audience in every way, shape, and form. So thank you all, and I think I'm kicking it back to Julia, who will also make clear how to buy this book, which is the most important thing anybody can do right now.
Thanks,
Yes,
Jen.
just to reiterate, a truly extraordinary discussion. Many thanks to Julia Gillard, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Ben Rhodes, and our audience out there for being so engaged throughout this discussion. Your patronage and dedication enable us to host these types of events, and we would not be able to do them without the book sales to support them. So please head on over to the link in the chat to purchase your copy of Women in Power, Real Lives, Real Lessons, or feel free to visit politics-prose.com. And while you're there, you can check our events calendar for other events we've got coming up. It's going to be an exciting spring. We hope to see you there. And from our shelves to yours, we hope you're out there staying safe, staying strong, and staying well read. And we'll see you next